Amanda will be very impressed with me. I managed to do that right. Good afternoon, and thank you to GTAC for the invitation to participate in the session. I did it 2 years ago and absolutely loved it. And it's one of the few events where I can engage with people from this sort of, as you can see, how grey I am. So I kind of feel that I get millennial access. So it's an enormous privilege, since I have absolutely no idea what goes on in your lives. So a couple of quick poll to wake you up. So how many of you live in a township? Okay, so I know these are sensitive questions because it's day one, you're checking each other out, you want to be fly and so on. So, but you know, just for the sake of science, try and be truthful. So how many of you live in an apartment, in a CBD, or even if it's a decentralized CBD, a little strip mall with an apartment close to it? Okay, and you're renting, I presume. Okay, so the rest of you, the majority in this room, live in suburbs. Is that correct? No. So what's left? Hey? Are you, how many freeloaders at home? Freeloaders at home? Or with a partner? Okay, a couple. So where do you live? Villages. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Okay, so how many of you live in something that is not a suburb and that is, or that's not a township? Townships are suburbs, but you know what I mean, and not an apartment. Let's see, come on. Put the day one jitters aside. You still fly. Good, okay. So there's a lot of people who didn't participate. So how many of you are paying off a mortgage? Yes. Okay, it's the old fogies in the room. Just the students who are participating this week. How many of you are paying off a mortgage? This is your chance to be fly. It's okay if you distort the poll. Okay, so how many of you are paying rent? All of you. Okay. Right, and then the rest are the freeloaders. Good. Okay. So we'll kind of delve into why your life is as difficult and complicated as it is, since I know you're all sort of obviously working very hard, being here, being upskilled so that you can get that next promotion and you can get that bond in that fantastic suburb where your kids can potentially go to that amazing school. But you know, for the vast majority of people in South Africa living in cities or towns or rural areas, they're stuck. Okay? They don't have trajectories of opportunity. And this is really at the heart of what we're grappling with in this session. Why is it, despite a growing economy, okay, we know it's not as fantastic as we hoped it was going to be, but it did grow pretty impressively for a while there, and generally really powerful redistributive investments that have seen a dramatic increase in access to basic services such as education and health, key drivers of social development and economic well-being and intergenerational social mobility. Most South Africans are pretty much stuck where they live, right? So I want to wrestle in this brief presentation with urban policy as it operates and as it manifests in our built environment today. And it's important, as Trudy has just done, to go back into a little bit of history to see continuities and discontinuities, and then pause on the impacts and the outcomes. And these are wicked, they're difficult, they're tough. And this is why it's a public economics question, because there are some important questions of priority, of sequencing and coordination of investments that we need to understand more effectively to be able to shift things. And then I want to reflect on my own backyard. I live in Cape Town. I was born there. and for my sins, kind of consigned to remain there for the rest of my days, I think, and then reflect on something I've done for the last year and a half, which was to step outside of my role as a policy wonk, because that's sort of what I'm fated to be, it seems, is to kind of work on policy after policy after policy to try and grapple with these questions, and spend some time with a bunch of Cape Townians from different walks of life to talk about this stuff. And I'll tell you what we've come up with as a set of propositions in conclusion. So the stuff of the apartheid city and the segregated city and the unequal city is hardwired into the concrete and the cement of our cities and towns. Okay? And the reason is, from the inception of urbanism during the era of colonialism in the Eastern Cape, the first prototype of how to organize the settlement of workers was in terms of a location policy, which saw the emergence of compounds. And compounds really became the prototype for the township. And this is pretty much what we still have today. And of course, they were obviously racialized from day one. We've then seen, after the Union, a succession of pieces of legislation before Grand Apartheid of 1948 that entrenched this use of land and the possibility of transforming land use into an economic asset and into an economic value through various pieces of legislation. So come apartheid, of course, we then had more aggressive policies that further consolidated that template into the structure of our towns in the form of the Group Areas Act, but also how fiscal policy operated in terms of the ways in which the black areas were designed to actively cross-subsidize white areas so that white residential areas could achieve municipal standards that was in excess of what was the norm in the most advanced countries in the world. Okay? That's why, for those of you who've managed to make the transition into the suburb, why you've got these amazing green spaces, fantastic verges, these sort of islands in the middle of roads that get trimmed and mowed and so forth. It's incredible. If you go anywhere in the world, this is really bizarre, right? That we do this as an upper middle income country. If you look at our peers around the world, it is not normal. Okay? It is a distortion. And we're very happy to sort of enjoy that as the middle class, but I promise you it is not the norm. It is a hangover of a period where some of these standards were codified into municipal regulation and so forth. One of the sort of most eminent geographers who've studied this over a long period came to this conclusion that at the turn of the transition, remarkably few urban dwellers had lived even a part of their adult life in racially or ethnically integrated conditions. Okay? That's quite something. That's like 25 years ago. So what was the plan to fix all of this? Sorry, my fonts went all haywire. That's the problem when you have to give up Steve Jobs for Gates. Interestingly, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time, right? So there was this period leading up to the first interim constitution, the Codesa negotiations that produced the agreement to have the elections in '94. And at that moment, we said pretty much verbatim what we say today about how to fix the problem. And the reason for this is that policy analysts and researchers and scholars from the 1970s, late 1970s, in the wake of the Soweto crisis, had a fairly acute analysis about what was wrong and how to fix it. And it was clear that the disconnect of where black working class South Africans were living and where they were working were one of the key structuring elements that reproduced inequality, right? And not just spatial inequality, but also intergenerational inequality. And so, very clear, this of course translated into the RDP. You may have heard of this document. It was the bedrock of the ANC's manifesto. In fact, it was the manifesto for 1994 and became the bedrock of national policy. And most of the suite of legislation that we see today and that gets amended periodically, as we've just heard, still derives from the imagination of the Reconstruction and Development Program. And as you can see from that quote, we were very, very clear about what needed to be done to solve the problem. And I draw your attention to the ideas of land reform, compact cities, decent public transport, and the development of industries and services that use local resources or meet the needs of local people, or local needs as it was stated. So for the urban realm, this translated into a sort of a vast array of policies and legislation, dealing from housing and land, which was the public housing program, I'll say something about in a minute, making sure that people didn't just get shelter, but also access to basic services, and very importantly, that the connective infrastructures or the network infrastructures as Marius, oh, by the way, Marius is no relation. We're just two coloureds with the same surname from the Cape. In case that was kind of bothering you, I want to make sure you're focused on what I'm talking about. So the network infrastructure subsidies, and Treasury has been particularly preoccupied in the last decade or so to refine and to sharpen these various subsidy instruments so that we can get the kind of spatial outcomes or impacts that would be more conducive to the vision that the RDP had set out. And then importantly, democratic decentralization. So we established robust urban and other forms of local authority. And key to this was a participatory planning system, but also fiscal decentralization. And I mention this because it is important to recognize we've got the legal and the policy tools to put people and people's demands and their power at the center of the system. We have chosen not to, but that is not the intent of the policy framework. Okay? Now, what happened was we've had a massive distortion over the last 24 years. The reason for this is that the first of this agenda, housing and land, took precedence over everything else. And what happened was that we said by 2000, we're going to deliver 1 million houses to South Africans. And of course, that sounds amazing politically, right? Like you are promising free houses to the electorate. That's gold. You can't possibly go back on that promise. And so everything, but for a set of administrations that were new, 9 new provinces, a whole suite of local governments that have just been established in 1996, they're still trying to figure out how to equalize salaries. They're still trying to figure out how many sanitation trucks they have. They have no idea how to do development at this point. All of these institutions have to deliver 1 million public houses within 4 years, effectively, okay? And that then, interestingly enough, people often talk about the World Cup, but if you look at the capacity to do the transactions and to deliver that amount of stock within 5-6 years, it is pretty remarkable. It is pretty remarkable. The problem is, it kind of put the cart before the horse. And we have no idea at the moment how to kill off that horse or how to rebuild the cart, because we kind of on this track and the horse has got enormous momentum and it has created a certain path dependency in the system that is very, very difficult to shift, because you can't say we've delivered 3.5 million subsidies since '94, and now we're not doing that anymore because it's producing the wrong spatial outcomes, right? That's political suicide. So that's the dilemma that we're struggling with. So I'm going to unpack it in a little bit more detail and then flip to what could we possibly be doing to address this. So just to remind you, in case you have maybe some career insecurity, there's been no shortage of policies to deal with these anomalies since '94. We have churned them out, okay? So we do a lot of thinking, a lot of research, a lot of production, and we kind of say the same thing, but we do get better at saying it again. So the last one here, I was involved with very directly. I was involved in too many of these, which is embarrassing. But the last one, the Integrated Urban Development Framework, was adopted by Cabinet in April 2016. And it was meant to be a boombox, a kind of echo to government in a beautiful auditorium like this, where they tell themselves the story that I've just laid out to you, and they commit to solve it. Okay? So it is government speaking to itself across all its spheres and across all of its sector departments and saying, we are the perpetrators of fragmented spatial development, and we need to own up, and we need to fix this. That's all the IUDF really is. And I chaired a technical panel that supported the interministerial committee that worked on this policy. And so I have read all of those policies, unfortunately, which is all the gray hair. And I also have seen a lot of research and primary data that kind of tells us in stark numbers and trend lines just how intractable these problems are. So what's happened, and here's my so I love this photograph because it's the best standard of RDP house you get, 42 squares, and the entrepreneur that household owner is immediately ensured rental income by not doing a backyard shack, so my net sewer sidebar shack, right, and double story. How cool is that? Fantastic. But this is really emblematic of the de facto outcome of this policy. So what have we done? The numbers change, and Neville Cheney will be here on Wednesday to talk to about us. He's the DDG in human settlements. The problem with this is, as I've said, is that this has created unintended consequences. We've effectively, because we could only build these houses at the edges of the city, because the subsidies got to cover the cost of land and the top structure. So the only way you can do it effectively, and the developers get a small margin, is to have very low cost land where you build, and that's at the edges of cities and towns. And so what we've done effectively is we've paradoxically worsened urban fragmentation, segregation, and spatial inequality. So one little illustration, it's not just that. That's not the only unintended consequence. We've also produced forms of densification that our municipal systems are not geared to meet. So this is Dunoon. It is a settlement to the north of Cape Town, right in the heart of an industrial area. Public housing was delivered there in 2000 for 3,000 households. Within a decade, we saw the densification of that settlement to the extent that we now have 16,000 households, and instead of a population of 15,000, we've got 66,000 people living there. Okay? Now, if you're a spatial economist, that will make you very happy. Yes, there are a brand of economists who feel happiness and joy. Because that is agglomeration, and you can get all kinds of benefits from that. The problem is that the infrastructure designed for that area cannot cope with those number of households, and so you can't optimize that density. Okay. Another example. This is Gauteng. So what this shows you is one of the more recent absurdities. So I kind of lose track of the cabinet reshuffles. So I'm an academic, so I can say irreverent things about government people. But somehow they still ask me to come back. I don't know why, but they do. So academic freedom is still, sort of alive and well in South Africa. So what this shows you is sort of where the economy is anchored, which is the red dots. And then the big blue dots by size shows you new planned public housing programs in the province of Gauteng. On the back of a policy announcement, not a policy announcement by the then Minister of Human Settlements, Lindiwe Sisulu, that the way to go, even though we've recognized all of the unintended consequences, is to double down on public housing. So instead of a target of 1 million, we're going to achieve a target of 1.5 million. And the way we're going to do it is to go big, is to do mega public housing projects. And this is the distribution of those opportunities in Gauteng. Lunacy, madness. This was like 2012, 2013. right? So by this time, all the data, all the evidence, we knew all of the problems that I've told you before. Okay, and this was after Treasury had gently worked with the metros to get them to think much more strategically in spatial terms about where they're going to sort of insert public housing investment so that you can achieve a whole range of developmental outcomes. And this went in direct contradiction to that. So I just mention that because I want you to kind of grasp the complexity of different funding streams achieving different funding outcomes. So I'm going to just skip the next slide just so that you know we're not done with all the policy stuff. We're still at it. And that there's a whole variety of things going on. There's actually more here. I went to a Treasury workshop 3 weeks ago on various national housing, national planning initiatives, and almost committed suicide on the way back. So this problem is getting worse, okay? So the sort of point that I want to just leave you with regard to this before I flip to a different register is that if we don't have a clearly defined center point with authority to address policy inconsistencies, these numerous initiatives translate into contradiction and confusion from a municipal perspective, okay? And it also reinforces the power of the silos. So even though we now have a national policy that calls this out and that makes a proposal to think in fundamentally new ways about investment, it asks for all of government to think about the return on investment, which is at the intersection of investment into people, health and education, place, when you put economic infrastructure in, you put housing in, you put other infrastructure in, and the economy, and only then do we know that this is the right kind of investment. It gives us a methodology to begin to rethink this. And what was interesting is our former president, sort of made this really interesting acknowledgement that the agenda of radical economic transformation is intimately tied to achieving this kind of human settlement transformation. The current policy instrument that Treasury is trying to use to drive this forward for the metros is the Built Environment Performance Plan, and COCTA is mirroring this for secondary cities as a program they're rolling out at the moment. And essentially what this is doing through the city support program is to help metros to think more strategically about their budget allocations and prioritization. So we come back to this question of return on investment and the sequencing of investments. Now I kind of highlight there the point of TOD because I want to use that as a thread to unpack the complexity of this in the case of Cape Town. So in the case of Cape Town, what we are doing is we sort of try and think this issue of whether you live in the suburb or in the township as a way to stylize in a very simplistic way what the current investments are achieving in terms of spatial form. So if you think of it, when we look at the townships or the majority city, we put in money for basic services, for sites and service upgrading, for B&G housing, and for BRT access through the new BRT infrastructures in the cities. For the suburbs, the municipalities, that's their golden goose through the rates account, right? So you've got to make sure you maintain those fantastic Canadian standards. You've got to make sure you promote new real estate developments. So all of these retail malls that are flourishing everywhere with the anchor tenants that we just heard about, cool to go, even if that destroys informal economies and so forth, because all of that is great to make sure we can reproduce that urban form. And of course, at the heart of the new agenda is how do we grow that mixed city, right? And here the thinking is the TOD model, that's the golden key. So in Cape Town, they've done this amazing work with the support of Treasury to produce a new sort of map that thinks from its TOD backbone, from its public transport system, and then it says these 5 sites is where we're going to target our investments. I can say a lot about them, I won't. They overlay that with what the provinces want to do, and then they've also just purchased land to be anticipatory, which was owned by Denel, one of the parastatals, and then there's existing projects that kind of fit in the frame, and then they've drawn big circles. So for the planners in the room, you'd be happy to know, your power still holds. Planners draw circles on maps, they color them in, and then they're very, very happy. It has no relation to the real world, but, you know, that's, it makes for pretty pictures like this. And so what you see here is an attempt to think through it, but it is very, very crude. And because the market doesn't work this way, the market doesn't think in this way. And the capacity in urban authorities to think about leveraging private investment and how to do that is pretty much non-existent, which is why you are being trained, because there's not enough economists in the system. So the question we then ask is, can this save Cape Town? And think of Cape Town as a proxy, because I guess Cape Town is the poster child for how you do segregation. So if you then sort of drill down, I live there, so I can say that. And I've made it out of the hood, so I can definitely say that. So if you look at public housing, you know, sort of that's the distribution of households' income in Cape Town, 2011. So you can see those are all the households that qualify for public housing. So I know when you read the news, it feels like no one in Cape Town has housing. We protest about housing every day. That's just how we roll. And then the mortgage market only covers a very small proportion of households. And then we kind of know we've got to worry about that middle where you all fall, probably, until that promotion you're going to get, which we don't really have instruments that work for. We do have instruments, but we don't really implement them. On the right-hand side, you can see the distribution by race in terms of household income. So you can see the enormous inequalities in inter-race terms, okay? Now this is important because we've got to understand that distribution in relation to space, okay? And so one of the issues that I want to kind of leave with you as a provocation is to really think through whether a focus on TOD nodes is enough. And I'll say more about that in a sec. So this is pictures you would have seen before. This shows you the disjuncture between where residential densities are and where employment, sorry, those labels are wrong. It should be the other way around. I will blame that on Bill Gates as well. So the top map shows you employment densities. And no, that's right. Sorry, it was I did it right. You did try and fix it. It is right. So you can see. So the reds in the residential density would be the informal settlements, but you can obviously see the traditional apartheid problem. People have to travel to work. So what has the state done in the last 16 years? It's put all of the investments in that area where the working class live, but the private sector had other ideas. Okay, so this is where private investment has gone over that same period. And so this is what I mean by an inability to crowd in this investment, right? And so whether just focusing on these transit-oriented nodes, which is the black dots in this framework of the city of Cape Town, is enough to configure that is the big question we've got to ask. And the conclusion we've kind of come to is that if you have a real estate-based agenda for integration, it is not going to cut it. Because essentially what this boils down to is that if we can get transit hubs where the BRT bus comes, the taxis come, and other buses and so forth, if they still exist after the Competition Commission's research, then we're going to put mixed income rental housing there, and that's how we're going to integrate our citizens. But that's the imagination we have at the moment. That's as good as we can do. Okay, we've been at this for 40 years, but that's kind of how far we are. And is that good enough if we think of the zeitgeist at the moment of our country and our cities, right? Everyone is hurtful, like totally hurtful, right? Just prices are going up, can't put kids through school, can't pay for water, can't have a shower. Sorry, that's a Cape Town thing, but you know what I mean. And of course, linked to questions of rise of identity movements, anti-racism movements, rise of land movements, politics, land occupation politics, whatever you want to call it, and this underlying drag on all of this that we are confronted with internal economic stagnation at the moment. Of course, Trudy's sorting that out, so okay, we can take that off the slide, but okay, let's say her job is not as easy as it should be. I'm so putting it on my CV. I was sitting next to the person raising $100 billion. Is that right? I can't even say it. Okay, so, you know, the question we grapple with is this, is that if we now look back over the last 40 years, we've kind of known what to do for a very, very long time. Is it possible that you can have the right policies and still make no impact? Right? It's like quite an important question, especially in your shoes, right? Because this is your career, this is where you're going. And I think yes, because I think this is the problem, in part, is that we've got people who are very good technocrats, but they don't understand the politics and the culture and the spirit of transformation. They don't have gees. And what gees means is that you don't treat the law and regulation as a tool or a hammer for compliance, but you treat it as something that enables innovation. And that distinction just does not exist for 99% of the public officers that I've engaged with on some of these questions. And certainly was the impression I was left with at this Treasury workshop, where 4 different national government departments came and represented competing legislation at the same workshop. Kudos to Treasury to bring them together. There was no therapist in the room, which was maybe the problem, but you know, it's incredible. So, to conclude. So, in the last year and a half, I brought together 30 people from Cape Town, from the social movements, private sector, big and small. Naspers was there. Some guys representing small black real estate companies were there. Public service, academics, yeah, we do let them in also, and NGOs. And we spent a year just talking in the Integration Syndicate about what's wrong with Cape Town. And do we need to change the narrative? Is there a different way to think about this problem? Is it not just an issue of TOD? So the first sort of frame I want to just leave with you is to think of settlements in a much more integrated way. I'm out of 3 more minutes, Joanne. Sorry, I'm going slightly over 3 minutes. Okay, great. So to think about, you know, sort of how are different settlements where you, the different places where you live, how do we think of that as an interconnected system? And the argument I think has to be at the core of this is we've got to place the township at the center of our analysis. It is not at the moment, okay, for, I think, good economic reasons, but for me, recognizing the implications of absolute stunted social mobility for black youth growing up, born in and growing up in a township context has got to be our #1 policy concern, okay? And understanding the spatiality of it, and I would argue that there is something around a question of a crisis of meaning and identity associated with that context that we don't have a language for. We don't know how to speak about. So we use race as a proxy, we use some of the other intersectional debates as a proxy, but there's something more profound there that we haven't yet found a language to speak, because we focus on jobs, or we focus on a house, or we focus on an electricity connection. But there's something more profound about being a citizen in a place, in a city, and what that means in an everyday sense that we haven't yet found a language for. So we've built 5 propositions, and I won't take you through all of them. I will just look very, very briefly at 3. We'll do some further work on this. But this is to kind of think in a more jiu-jitsu way about our inheritances and how do we move forward. And the first is to recognize that mobility is key, but maybe the BRT emphasis is a mistake. So why don't we look at what we call the evolved taxi? Think of digital platforms so that you can begin to create an Uber-like operating system so that you can control speed. You can create all kinds of opportunities to optimize this investment for black owners. And you can also create the basis for an electronic integrated public transport system that already reaches. So the surveys tell us that most urban South Africans are at most within a 15 to 20 minute walk of a minibus taxi. So in that sense, we've solved public transport, right? But we haven't created this. And if you look at Cape Town's projected CapEx budget, you can see that the largest number is BRT trunk routes. So if we rethink the subsidy regime, which means we've got to rethink the intergovernmental system, we've got to rethink a whole bunch of stuff, But then if we think really of this digitized minibus taxi as the core of the system, and we allow these owners to really sweat their assets, to transition into a new business model, we can solve a myriad of our urban challenges. The second proposition, living differently, moratorium on sprawl, use state-owned land in schools and green spaces that we're over-endowed with because of the history that I mentioned, and think of a different typology of public housing that allows for small black contractors to build public housing so that that 40 billion we spend goes into the right businesses. And I'll show you the ideas we have in mind here. This is 6 school sites and public sites we've chosen, 2 in the suburbs, Pinelands and Newlands, 1 in Pelican Park in Mitchell's Plain, and then a site in Khayelitsha. This is the site which is Saks, and the point here is to shock the middle class out of their compliance and to show that we can put public housing for domestic workers, gardeners, security guards, right in the heart of the suburb with some very, very clever design. That's not in Fordham. So if you look at this one site, this is a proposition, to put some 3-story walk-ups in that area. I want my Mac, please. Then this becomes possible, right? Similarly, these are 7 public schools in Mitchell's Plain with no articulation to each other, no shared facilities, no shared resources. They're all within a 10-minute radius. And if you begin to reimagine that using existing subsidies, you can create a completely different built environment that connects green space, recreational space, housing opportunities, social housing with a vibrant public transport hub. If you go to Pelican Park, you can create incredible agricultural opportunities, a market to the north of the city. I've got this, sorry. That was a market there, a public access to Zeekoevlei, wild spaces, sports facilities. These are the 2 existing schools and so forth. So there are different ways in which we can do things. The final part I'll skip, which is about public works. And just to sort of leave you with a story that blew me away in this regard, which is this center in Elsie's River, which is one of the harshest gang-ridden areas in the flats, where a local NGO has built an IT hub, and they are, through gaming, training programmers, working-class kids aged 9 to 12, who are, through Minecraft and other things, programming for international companies. And this is kind of a small example of the way in which we can use aspects of the 4th Industrial Revolution, notions of placemaking and community ownership, to build an experience of a different city. It can be in a small scale, but it is that building block that creates the momentum for some of these other ideas to flourish. Sorry that I took a bit long. Thank you.